Hello, my name is Julie Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance, and I want to thank you for joining. Our webinar today is presented by IDSA member Remediant, entitled Privilege Sprawl Index, Modeling Privilege Access Sprawl for Zero Trust Security. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's discussion, so please make sure to share the link with your colleagues. In addition to a link to the recording, you'll also receive a link to the slides that will be used in today's discussion. You can submit questions through the Q&A chat window. Our speaker will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. And lastly, I wanted to let you know that we are now an approved ISC squared CPE submitter partner. So starting in 2022, and actually a little bit early with this webinar, all of our live and on-demand webinars are eligible for CPE credits for ISC squared members. To request credits, please send an email to cpe@idsalliance.org with your name and member number. And I'll be displaying a message on how to do that as well throughout the webinar. So before I turn it over to our presenter today, a quick commercial for the Identity Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-defined security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. All of our resources are freely available on our website, idsalliance.org. So check back frequently for the latest blogs, upcoming webinars, and events. Okay, so let's get started. Our presenter today is Raj Dadiawala. Raj is president of Remediant, responsible for leading Remediant through its next phase of growth. In this role, Raj is applying his leadership and versatility to bring focus, agility, and collaboration across sales, marketing, finance, and operations at Remediant. Raj has 30+ years of experience in enterprise software and cybersecurity, primarily focused on bringing new disruptive products to new markets. So with that, Raj, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, my name is Raj Dodiawala. I'm at Remediant. And today I'm going to talk about a concept we've been developing that I've been working on that's called Privilege Sprawl Index. And it is a way to model privilege access sprawl that's relevant and pertinent to achieving zero trust security. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank Identity Defined Security Alliance, IDSA, and Julie for facilitating this webinar for us. And also thank you all for taking the time to attend this talk. Certainly you're here live, but I also want to thank you people that view this particular recording on demand. So appreciate your time and welcome any input you may have along the way. So first, let's go through some definitions. We define sprawl, or I guess if you Google sprawl, you get something of this sort, right? It's a group or mass of something that has spread out in an untidy or irregular way. And then if you look at the definition of privilege, it's a special right or advantage or immunity that's granted or made available only to a particular person or a specific group. And then we take privilege sprawl and kind of look at it from an IT perspective, right? It is an IT situation that attackers drool over. It is the attack surface, and it is a point of pain for security teams. So what I mean by that is that security teams, as they're looking at investigating attacks and incidents in their environment, they see that one of the key vectors that has been leveraged by these attackers is the fact that there's a lot of privilege accounts available on these endpoints, right? And of course, this situation is created by IT in a sense that IT has to provide administrative control to a certain number of users so that the infrastructure, the computing devices can be managed by the appropriate administrators, right? So obviously they're doing their job and they're doing it right. And the security teams are experiencing or noticing that there is a problem with that. And together they need to work and figure out how to tame this privilege sprawl. So privilege sprawl just kind of happens, right? We know from years and years of managing our LDAP or Active Directory and so on, right? As organizations grow, as M&A happens, organically, inorganically, organizations grow. And of course, people come and go as well. So sometimes, or more often than not, there is a fear of breaking something, that if I remove this admin account, not sure what the side effects are or what the implications of that would be. So I'm just kind of going to leave it there. And the corollary to that is the point below, that oftentimes it is harder to provision again, to reprovision an account, than to just leave it there. I'm just going to leave it there for a little while, because if I remove it and then I need it again, it's a hassle, right? And sometimes the opposite true, is easier to provision, but it's a pain to remove it. And I touch on that in a bit as well. The other part is just elevate. If somebody asks for a special, there's a special request, I want to manage certain things on particular systems or what, and the best thing to do is, okay, I'm just going to elevate your privilege, your admin privileges for a while, and then later on I may remove it, but generally, of course, people forget, and it goes back to fear of breaking something, etc. And more often than not, that just elevated happens inside of a group. So there's a group that is allocated for providing that level of privilege, and add somebody to it. And what happens oftentimes, that group or a nested group will inherit additional capabilities that we don't really recognize, right? So these groups and subgroups themselves create some sort of a situation where you're oftentimes giving more privilege than what has been requested. This is kind of an important one that we've run into again and again in customer scenarios, that I really don't know where an account, a privilege or admin account exists. I can go to AD and I can look at all of the accounts that exist in my directory. But for me to know where this account exists on endpoints is quite a chore. If it's even possible, it takes forever. And with distributed systems or geographically distributed network or enterprise environments, it is quite a task. And then the final item here is that there is oftentimes unfortunately, a lot of shadow IT that gets created, right? Idea here is that I'm an admin. I have to go through a pain in order for me to connect and log into a system and do what I need to do. Maybe I've got some, password vault or what have you, and it's an onerous process. And oftentimes I will just temporarily perhaps create a second account. Like I'm Raj, I'll create Raj 2, I'll give it the same privilege as Raj, and then Raj can go away or can just sit there no matter what, but I can continue to use the second account for as long as I want, right? And we see that again and again in customer environments. So privilege sprawl just happens. There is not a malintent or anything like that. It is just the processes and procedures within an organization are such that it is very hard to control the sprawl. And empirically, this is what we see, right? So these are real examples. Small enterprise, about 3K employees, about mid-sized enterprise with about 20K, or a very large enterprise with over 200,000 employees. And I'll focus on the middle one, right? There are just under 6,000 unique admins, what you see in the black bar at the bottom, right? 5,779 unique administrators amongst the 20,000 employees at this particular company. And they have 1.3 million instances. So these are 1.3 million logins available to these about 6,000 admins across the infrastructure, right? So just think about that, right? So there are, if you look at this as an attack surface, any credential that gets compromised, this is the kind of coverage up to 1.3 million potential opportunities that an attacker has with some number of admin credentials that they can actually take control of this particular environment, right? So again, privilege sprawl means a large attack surface. You just land somewhere at anywhere in the organization, and you should be able to, you may be able to move laterally, you gain a foothold, and then you can then use that foothold to do other things. Once you're in the environment, you have many options, many chances. Or if you don't, if you aren't successful on one system, you'll be successful on second or the third or the fourth, but you will be successful pretty soon. And we know this, we see this every day, right? This is kind of the news that we hear about in terms of the cybersecurity events we read about in the press. The other thing is, and this is also pretty important, that all admin access is available all the time, right? So always on, always available 24/7, right? So the attacker by no means is restricted to a time of the day or amount of time or a window of opportunity. This is just there waiting to be had, if you will, right? And then, of course, we all are striving to achieve zero trust in our environment, but we are not recognizing that we are treating admins as an admin all the time, that they are sacred, their accounts are required. We can't even fathom an admin account being removed from an endpoint for the fear that I don't know how I'm going to manage that particular endpoint, right? So that is not an easy path to zero trust in the way things are. Now, this is really the key, right? Lateral movement is the real problem with privilege sprawl. So even if one system got compromised with those 1.3 million, logins that are available, admin logins that are available, I need to attack one, and from there I can move around quite readily through the rest of the environment until I find the crown jewels. And this is, of course, the key method, the key technique that is time and again proven to be successful in pretty much any attack that you hear about today or in the last, foreseeable past. So what we are doing here is introducing the notion of privilege sprawl index, right? So privilege sprawl index is a concept that we're introducing here in the rest of the talk. And we'll explain that. There's a good bit of math around the model that's been built, and I'll try to be as succinct or targeted as possible. I have actually taken out a lot of the finer details because I didn't want to get too much into the weeds, but of course I'm available. Please reach out to me for any questions, or if you want to drill down further into some of the concepts, some of the math that underlie these concepts. So to get started, let's look at these diagrams, this pictures here, right? So on the left, we have a system S labeled X. So system X is the one that's on the left-hand side. And that system has a set of privilege accounts called PX, right? So PX is the set of admin accounts or privilege accounts that exist on a system SX. And PI is one instance of that of a privilege account or an admin account, right? So PI is an admin account. It belongs to the set PX, and PX is on SX, right? In further to the right, PX is a set in SX, PY is a set in SY, and so on, right? And when you look at the intersecting set, so there are privilege accounts, let's say admin 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first system, admin 2, 3, 4, 5 on the second system. Then there is that intersecting set between the two, which we call PXY, right? And then finally, to the right-hand side is a system we called SZ, synonymously known as CZ, which is the system that has crown jewels. So system SZ or CZ has PZ set of accounts on it, and it is the system that has all the crown jewels, the sensitive data, the customer accounts, your intellectual property, whatever the case might be, which is the target that the attackers are after, right? So now in words, just to reiterate and to make sure we get this right? So PX is the set of privilege accounts that are provisioned on any given system SX. PI is one of those accounts that belongs to the set PX. PXY are the common accounts between any two systems, SX and SX and SY. And then there is a special system called CZ, which has the crown jewels, right? This is the critical system that's people after. And then what we say is that privilege sprawl index is a number between 0 and 1, where 0 means there is no sprawl, right? So this is the way we're defining and arriving through this model at a privilege sprawl index of 0, which is no sprawl, hard if not impossible to move laterally. And privilege sprawl index of 1, which is the easiest to move laterally. And of course, between 0 and 1, there are some scenarios that we'll discuss as well. Right. So the key takeaway is privilege sprawl index is between 0 and 1. 0 is no-go, is the safest and the best place to be. And 1 is sort of the worst place to be in a sense. So let's look at privilege sprawl index of 1, right? This is 1, if I have an account PI that I compromise on a system SX, right? So PI is an account we said belongs to the set of privileged accounts or admin accounts on SX, and that gets compromised, right? And if that same account exists on your crown jewel systems, of course, you could attack a crown jewel system right off the bat with PI and you're in, and you can do what you want. You can take the, the data breach happens, right? But oftentimes that's not typically how it works, right? Some other system gets compromised and then attackers move laterally. So with PI, that's common to the system that's attacked or breached to the system that needs to be breached. I can easily migrate laterally, it's reachable, and my job is done is the easiest way to go, right? So of course, PI is on SX and it's also on CZ. And if necessary, on all systems reachable from SX to CZ. So it may not be that PI, that SX and CZ are on the same, network or data center or whatever the case might be, or not sort of quote unquote adjacent. And the attacker may not know actually where CZ is. And so they may hop around from system to system, but in all cases, PI enables them to hop around from system to system until they actually get to the crown jewels, right? Of course, the easiest case is when privilege sprawl index is 1, within one account, I can get to anywhere in the environment. That's another way to think about it. Now we've run some tests and experiments, and we know, like with Mimikatz, for example, I can do pass the hash, I can mine the LSAS memory and be able to harvest the hash of an admin and then move it around to the next system and so on. And that actually leads us into scenario number 1, where privilege sprawl index is not 0, it's not 1, but it's somewhere in between 0 and 1. Right? So in this case, there is, again, PXZ is the intersection of the admin accounts on X and the admin accounts on Z, right? And that this intersecting set is not null, right? However, the account that is compromised PI does not belong to that intersecting set. So PI does not belong to PXZ. So basically what we're saying is that there is a non-empty set of accounts that are common to the two systems, but the account that is compromised is not in that set. So now that account that's compromised, you get in there and you have to discover credentials of one of these other accounts that is in the intersecting set in order to move laterally, right? So that's what line 3 says, that assume that PI takes control of the admin account PK. So PI discovers the hash or password, whatever mechanism that, smartness that's available in that particular malware, it's able to determine PK. And PK it knows is in the intersecting set, or it discovers that is an intersecting set that allows it to get to the crown jewel system, right? So PK belongs to the intersecting set, that's line 4. Now, let's look at what it means, right? The effort to obtain this PK is what we call PXZ choose 1. That's line 6, or in sort of English, PXZ choose 1, right? So essentially it reduces to PXZ. So if there are 5 accounts, for example, in the intersecting set, I only need to find one of them in order for me to move laterally to the next system, right? So out of 5, choose 1, that gives me 5 choices, right? So that's the PXC choices that I have for me with one compromised credential PI to discover one of those 5 accounts or one of those PXZ accounts in order to move from SX to CZ. And that's what line 8 is saying, right? And in this case, and this is where I've left out all the math, I just call it delta. In this case, your privilege sprawl index is reduced from 1 by this amount delta. And delta, in sort of one way to explain that delta is that it's the effort to discover adjacent admin accounts, right? Because from PI, I still have to discover PK, which is one of those accounts that's in PXZ. So that's a little bit of effort. I could get discovered, I could get dropped, malware might not work, whatever the case is. But again, we know from today's events that all of these things are kind of daily occurrences, right? But even so, to move from one system to the next when there are no intersecting accounts that aren't compromised initially, there is an effort to discover additional accounts so that I can then move laterally. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is that there is no intersecting set between the system that's compromised and the crown jewel system. So I have PX and I have PZ are the two sets of privilege accounts, but the intersecting set is null, right? So I cannot even look to compromise or discover any other account in order to move to the critical system, right? So no common accounts. However, this is what 3 and 4, 5, 6 through 8 talk about. Now my mission is to discover some other intermediary system, right? Let's call this system SY, right? So I've compromised SX with PI. Now I'm going to discover an intermediary system that I can hop onto, and from there I can hop onto the crown jewel system CZ, right? So there is an intersecting set PXY between X and Y, and there is an intersecting set Y and Z between the systems SY and CZ, right? So here I have to, it's a two-step process that we described in scenario 1. First, I have to compromise from PI an account that's in PXY, let's call it PJ. And then using PJ, I have to compromise, as line 7 and 8 show, that I have to now find something in PYZ, let's call that PK, in order to get from SY to CZ, right? So I first find PJ, then I find PK, and then I am on the system CZ, right? And again, these are all choices. So from PXY, from the intersecting or common set of accounts, I find any one of them. So that gives me PXY choices first. And then on line 7 and 8, from PYZ, choose one, or I have PYZ choices in order to discover PK, right? So in this case, there are two sets of choices that I have to reckon. First choice is PXY, second choice is PYZ, and some combination of that then gets me to the final system that I care about or that I want to attack. So let's look at this pictorially, right? So scenario 1 and 2 are shown here. In scenario 1, we're showing that PI that is compromised is not in the intersecting set. It's that key in the middle, but PK is, and that's what PI needs to discover PK in order to move on the right-hand side. And the table below shows that, right? I got compromised. There is an account K that is common to CZ, and K needs to get compromised for me to move to CZ and so on. Now we go to the right-hand side, scenario 2, that I can hop directly from SX to CZ. I have to find some intermediary system, which is the system in the middle that has accounts PY on it. Again, I look for common accounts between PX and PY. I find PJ. Then using PJ, I find PK, which is in the common set of accounts between PY and PZ. And then eventually I'm able to get to the crown jewel system. And here, the table at the bottom shows that I've compromised I have to discover J. And once I've discovered J, I have to find K in order to get to CZ, right? So this is sort of this is the effort that the attacker has to expend in order to get to. So it's not slam dunk, it's not 1, but it is somewhat less than 1 for the effort to discover additional accounts for the attacker to move and eventually discover the crown jewel system. Okay, so some conclusions. Privilege sprawl is the key element that enables lateral movement. Because there are privileged accounts, you compromise one and you can use that to move laterally or discover the other accounts to move laterally so that you can get to the crown jewels. And we see this, right? Through phishing or other mechanisms, a laptop or a desktop gets compromised, and that malware will download additional payload, will reconnaissance, will discover admin accounts, and will move around in the enterprise network. Oftentimes move very quickly. Sometimes it sits in there. This is advanced persistent threats. They'll sit there and figure out how to breach your environment sooner or later. Then we say that the privilege sprawl index of 1 is the easiest one. You can move laterally, get to the crown jewels, you can encrypt files, do whatever nastiness that happens simply because of the fact that you breach the account that enables you to reach to the right place in the environment. And then privilege sprawl less than 1 is still a large attack surface. I mean, we saw in some of the examples I showed before in the statistics I provided that there is still a pretty large attack surface irrespective of the size of the organization. Again, because we see this every day in the news, it is just a matter of time that the crown jewels would, the system with the crown jewels will get breached. So then our hypothesis is that should we not want privilege sprawl index of 0? And then isn't that going to prevent lateral movement completely? So the idea is to stop or prevent lateral movement, we should be at a privilege sprawl index of 0, or we must be at a privilege sprawl index of 0. So that's the goal, privilege sprawl index of 0. And if you think about it, let's say I remove, for a moment, let's say I remove each and every admin account from each and every endpoint. So there are no admin accounts, what Gartner calls 0 standing privilege, right? So in the examples and the scenarios I presented above, PXZ, PXY, PYZ, all of those intersecting sets between two systems, the intersecting sets of privilege accounts between any two systems is empty, right? So these are systems, they're islands in their own right. They have no common accounts. If they have no common accounts, how can you move laterally from one place to the other? In a sense, they're air-gapped from a privilege standpoint. So now, how do you manage the system? You provision just in time. So you provision an account to the right system at the right time for the right amount of time, and then you take it away and you go back to 0 standing privilege. And if you do that, right, only that one system is potential for getting compromised. And even if it got compromised, that particular account doesn't exist anywhere else. Remember, these are all islands in their own right. It's not going to be, you're not going to be able to move laterally from one of these systems to any one of the other systems because this account just doesn't exist anywhere else, right? And so our claim here is, again, zero trust is about authorization. Or should you be allowed to access the system 24/7, right? Are you authorized to access the system all the time, right? And our claim is no. And zero trust is not about authentication. Authentication basically says, are you the right person to be accessing the system? Yes, you may be the right person, but are you allowed to access the system? Perhaps not. At least not all the time, right? So the idea here is, as I stated just a bit ago, even if a single account PI in our examples, in our scenarios is compromised and is provisioned just in time, it's sandboxed. It has nowhere to go, right? And the other thing here is that we want to continuously monitor in order to maintain 0 standing privilege. Like, so let's say that, a phishing email does happen or print nightmare does get downloaded, and it will create a local admin account. And many instances of print nightmare in an environment will create many of those admin accounts that now can be compromised to move laterally, right? But if you do continuous monitoring and you keep cleaning up these spurious accounts or shadow accounts or any account that privilege account or admin account that exists, you're basically maintaining 0 standing privilege. These systems are islands in their own right with no ability from one to hop from one to the other, right? Now, of course, it's not always practical to remove all admin accounts. There may be reasons to keep them around, or some of these accounts, right, for a variety of reasons. And certainly we know service accounts or non-interactive accounts are often left alone because there are services that are running. They don't have the ability to request just-in-time access. So they may run for a period of time. But again, now you're aware of what your options are. You can think about reducing it over time, or you can start by saying, I'm going to first look at all the domain admins in my Active Directory, all the enterprise admins, all my backup domain controller, backup admins, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some critical accounts that are built in for you. Even a local administrator account on an endpoint is something that needs to be the RID 500 account, right, can be looked at and determine whether those accounts should stay on these endpoints 24/7. And you can start at looking at your privilege access risk over time and try to get to a privilege sprawl index that's 0 or close to 0. So in summary, privilege account sprawl leads to a large attack surface. It also is the primary vector or method by which attackers move laterally. And we know that because of all of these cyber attacks and insider breaches that we see every day, ransomware attacks, et cetera, all leverage this particular technique. And then our concept of privilege sprawl index rather, we've shown that if it's equal to 1, then lateral movement is a slam dunk, it's a sure thing. Between 0 and 1, greater than 0, less than 1, is somewhat difficult, but it's still possible, right, to move as we've seen in everyday attacks. This is kind of where we typically do operate. And then, of course, 0, privilege sprawl index, is the best protection against lateral movement. And we introduce the notion of 0 standing privilege. So future work, we are looking at effect of time, as in dwell time. Recognize that if I've compromised an account and I have to discover other accounts, I've got my cybersecurity tools that might discover this particular activity and be able to shut it down. So what does that mean? So you have a certain level of protection from lateral movement, but is it foolproof? Perhaps not, but we still need to look at the effect of time on the ability to move laterally to eventually get to your crown jewels, right? We also want to look at some practical applications of the index. So how do we, empirically and, through this model determine and quantify privilege sprawl, look at how the intersecting accounts exist within a given environment, arrive at that privilege sprawl index number between 0 and 1, use that to gauge privilege access risk, and then from there determine to what extent you want to control this privilege. So this is work in progress actually on quantifying it, privilege sprawl index in a real environment, and then providing a privilege access risk dashboard, if you will, to see how to manage or visualize, analyze, and manage your privilege sprawl. And then, of course, secondary accounts do get created, particularly by attackers, and how does that play into defining or changing the profile of a privilege sprawl, right? I'm certainly open to collaboration if you want to verify or help further refine or evolve these concepts. More than happy to work with you on this. So please feel free to contact me with your critical feedback as well as ideas that you may have. Happy to share that and collaborate with you on that. Once again, thank you much for your time. I thank you to members of the IDSA and Julie for helping us or facilitating this webinar. And on behalf of Remediant, thank you for your time. Bye.